In this video, to head down the path towards authentication, we're going to be adding the necessary properties to the user model that are currently missing. Currently, the user document has only one property, an email, and the email isn't even validated. We have to make some changes to this one as well as adding a few new ones. Now, to show you exactly what a user document is going to look like when we're all done, I'm going to make a simple object right here. This is going to be what the doc looks like, but you do not need to write this code. I'll be deleting it in just a moment. First up, obviously, we're going to have that email property. It is going to be validated, which means we will require it to look like a real valid email. Andrew@example.com would pass the validation. Next up, for signing up and logging in, we are going to need a password from the user. So we'll set up a password property, and the user will send their password in plain text. If they type mypass123, mypass123 is going to come to the server. We're not going to store it in plain text though, because that is not secure. If the database gets compromised, the person who hacked the database will now have access to the person's email and their plain text password, which is a really big problem. Not only could they log into our service, but a lot of people use the same password across other services, so they might be able to log into someone's bank account or other accounts you obviously don't want someone hacking into. This means that we're going to be hashing this password using the bcrypt algorithm, which we'll talk about later. Essentially, a one-way hash means we take this value and we convert it into a really long string of a fixed length, regardless of the value passed in, and this is what we're going to store in the database. It's impossible to get the original value back from the hashed value. It is a one-way algorithm, meaning we can take a value and hash it, but we can't unhash a value. That's exactly what we want here. We never want to be storing our passwords in plain text. Now, the last property we're going to be adding is called tokens. Tokens is actually going to be an array. It's going to be an array of objects, where each object is a login token. Imagine I log into the to-do application from my mobile phone and the website. I'm going to want to have different authentication tokens, and those are going to get stored in the tokens array. Now, an individual token is going to look something like this. We'll have an access property that specifies the token type. The only one we'll be setting up in this course is an authentication token type, although you could have other tokens for verifying things like email or resetting passwords. Next up, we're going to have the actual token value. This will be stored under the token property, and this is also, like the password, going to be a really strong, cryptographically secure string. This is the string that we're going to pass back and forth. When a user wants to make a secure request, they're going to send this along with their HTTP request, and we'll be able to validate that the user does indeed have access to do what they want to do, whether it's deleting a to-do, adding a to-do, or updating a to-do. Now, this is the user model we want to create, so let's go ahead and do it down below. First up, the email. There's a few things we need to change there. The first property we're going to add is a property called unique. The unique property, which gets set to either true or false, we'll be setting it to true in this case, verifies that the property email does not have the same value as any other documents in the collection. Imagine I'm signing up for a new account with an email that's already in use. It would pass if I had unique set to false, which is the default value, but when we set unique equal to true, we won't be able to have two documents in the user collection with the same email, and this is a good thing. Next up, we're going to add custom email validation. We need to verify that the string that got passed in is a valid email. Validating emails is an inherently tricky thing to do. There are a ton of edge cases and workarounds that need to be in place in order for email validation to work in all cases. Rather than writing and testing this library on our own, we're going to use a validator library that has an is_email function. It's a really simple function. It is well tested and well used, which means that we can guarantee it's going to work for our purposes. Now, to set up custom validation, we're going to take a quick look at the docs so you know where it exists, because there are a few features that we won't be using here, but that are really useful. To get to the docs page, we're going to Google mongoose in lowercase. There's no need to scream at the browser. Custom validation. The first result should be what we want, mongoose validation. It starts off with the basic validation. You already know how to do this, but down below, there is a custom validators section. Here we have a phone attribute, and on the attribute object, along with the type, we have validate. Validate takes two properties, the validator, this is the actual function that makes sure the value is valid, and the message. Inside of the message, we can even inject the actual value used. So we can say that ABC is not a valid phone number, or in our case, 123@gmail is not a valid email. Now, in order to get started, we're going to set up this attribute inside of our email object. Validate is going to be an object. Then we'll have the validator set equal to a function. The function gets called with the value to validate. You either return true if it's valid, or you return false if the value is invalid. Next up, we can set up our message. I'm going to set message equal to a string. We're going to inject the email that was used, and we'll say that email is not a valid email. Excellent. Now, the only thing left to do to get this email validation to work is actually install that third-party library and call the function inside of our validator. The library itself is called Validator. It's an NPM module, and you can find it by Googling NPM validator. It should be the first result. One handy little tip, if you're ever trying to make sure that the Google search result is indeed the result you want, you can look at the URL structure. It's always package/package name, which means that if you get a result like this one, which is /validate, you know it's the wrong library. What you really want is the validator library. Now, the validator library has a ton of validations built in. If you scroll down on the docs page, you can see there's basically an endless list. But the one they show off at the very beginning is the isEmail method, which is the one that we'll be using for our purposes. Over inside of the terminal, we can install the latest version of this module. npm install. The module is called validator. We'll be installing the most recent version 5.6.0, and I will use the save flag to update the package.json file. Now that we have the module installed, we can go ahead and move into our model file and actually implement it. The first thing we need to do is import the library. Up above, I'm going to change the var mongoose to a constant, which I should have done in the first place. It doesn't really matter, but it is a good habit. And I will also be creating a constant called validator, setting that equal to the return result from require. And we'll be requiring that new library, validator. Now on here, we have the isEmail function. It returns either true or false, which means that right inside of our custom function, we can simply return validator dot isEmail, passing in the value up above. Now this function is going to return true if the email is valid. It'll return false if it's invalid. And you might have noticed that we can actually make this even simpler. Instead of getting the value in our custom function and passing it into isEmail, we can actually pass in validator dot isEmail as the method to use. This is going to get past the value and it will return true or false. There is no reason to define a custom function. This method will work on its own. Now that we have our email property set up, we can move down below and start setting up the password attribute. Password, which will be called password, is going to be a string. So we'll go ahead and set the type equal to string. We're also going to require it. So I'll set required equal to true. And last but not least, we'll be setting the min length. The minimum length of the plain text password in our case is going to be 6, although you could use a different value. And this is all we need to do for password. Nothing too complex here. Next up, we're going to specify the tokens property. Now, as I mentioned, tokens is actually an array. This is a feature available in MongoDB that is not available in SQL databases like Postgres. This nested document is going to be how we access the tokens for individual users. In order to set up the schema to support that, we're going to set tokens equal to an array, and we're going to provide one object inside of it. This is the syntax that Mongoose has set up for our purposes. Now on this object, we're going to specify all of the properties available on a token. In our case, it's access. We'll set that equal to an empty object for the moment, and token, which we'll set to an empty object as well. Now we can go ahead and specify exactly what the access and token attributes should be. In the case of access, we're going to make sure that the type is a string, and we'll go ahead and require it by setting required equal to true. Required equal to true. And we're going to have the exact same setup for token. The type does need to be a string, and it will be required, so required will get set to true. And this is all we need to do for the tokens array. We're not going to be setting up any custom validation about the actual value for access or token. That'll happen a little bit later. It's going to be a little more complex because we do need to do a few things with those values, so we'll get to that in just a few videos. For now though, the user model is indeed complete. We have our email, it's validated and it's unique. We have our password, it's validated, and we have our tokens array. This means it's time to actually create the request that a user is going to be able to hit to sign up a new user. That's going to happen over in server.js, and it's also going to be your challenge for this video. This route is going to be a post HTTP call, post to /users, which is the exact same URL setup we had for creating new to-dos. When we want to create new users, we post to users. When we want to create new to-dos, we post to to-dos. To complete this route, you can go ahead and use anything we've learned so far. The most similar route we've created thus far would be the route to create a new to-do. The new to-dos route first creates a new instance of the model. Then we go ahead and call save. If things go well, we return the doc. If things go poorly, we send back the error. This is exactly what you're going to need to do for the post users request. Now, I'd also like you to use pick instead of pulling off the individual properties like we do up here. Here we create a new object, and on this object, we just specify text. What you're going to do instead is use pick like we do for the patch method. You're going to pick off the properties we want, which will just be email and password. This is going to give you the body variable, and you can pass that into the constructor function directly. Then you can call save, and you can respond appropriately, whether it's successful or whether it's an error. Now, we have made some pretty big changes to the user model. The most important change is that we've now made the email unique. In order for this change to actually work, you're going to need to, 1, shut down your server, 2, wipe the to-do app database, and 3, restart the server. If you do not wipe the database and restart the server, it's not going to validate the emails to be unique, which is going to be a big problem. Now, once you're done, I want you to play around with it. Go ahead and make a valid request in Postman, then try to make the same request, which should fail because the email will already be taken. Try to play around with invalid emails and passwords as well. Take a moment to pause the video, knock this out, test it, and when you're done, go ahead and click play. How'd you do? Hopefully you were able to get all of that done. I left it pretty open-ended, but the goal here is to set you out on your own when we're doing something we've already done before. And the code we're going to write here is indeed something we've done in the past. The first thing I'm going to do is call app.post to set up the post route, and we'll pass in the URL /users. Then we can set up our callback function with our request and response arguments. Next up, what I wanted you to do is use the pick method available on Lodash to pull off the email and password properties. We're never going to let users manually update the tokens array. They're not going to be able to directly access or manipulate this. We're going to be manipulating this using a set of methods, which we'll explore a bit later. For now, though, all we're going to do is create a variable called body, setting it equal to the return result from Lodash.pick. And the syntax for pick, if you remember, is the first argument, the object we want to pick from, and the second argument is an array. We want to pick off 2 properties, so we're going to add 2 items to the array. The first one will be email, and the second one will be password. Next up, we can make a new instance of our user model. A variable user will get the job done. We'll set that equal to new user. And we're going to pass in an object with the email and password properties. Now, we could recreate an object setting the email property equal to body email, but we already have that in body, so we can actually just pass it in like this. There's no reason to pass in an object that we create when we already have the object we need. Now, obviously, this is going to at most contain the email and password because we've picked those off. If any of them are missing, like the email's not provided, it won't be provided here either, so the validation will fail. We don't need to worry about creating the object manually. Next up, we can call user.save, which is actually going to try to save this document to the database. Now that we have the document saved, we can attach a then callback. By calling then, we can specify our success case. We're going to get that user doc, and we're going to be able to respond with it. We'll be setting up authentication in this route later. For now, though, a response send call passing back the user is going to get the job done. The next thing to do, and the last thing to do, is set up a catch call. Here, we're going to set up catch. We're going to get that error, and we're going to simply send it back. Response.status, a 400. Then we'll use .send to send it back. We'll send it back by sending back the error object. With this in place, we are now done inside of Atom, and we can move on to the next step, which is going to be to make sure our server is shut down and wipe the database in RoboMongo. I'm going to go ahead and drop the to-do app database by clicking it and clicking drop database. Now that the database is down, we can head into the terminal and start up the server. Node server/server.js. With the server now started on port 3000 over inside of Postman, we can test out the call by making a few requests. I'm already in the to-do app local environment, so that's good. I can change the method from get to post, and I can set up the URL, which is available in an environment variable. From here, all we need is /users, which is the route we just created. We are going to be sending along some body data, body raw. JSON is going to let us do just that. I can then go ahead and set up the JSON. We're going to pass in those two properties, email. We'll set that equal to a valid email like andrew@example.com, and password. I'm going to set password for the moment equal to a valid password as well, something with greater than 6 characters, ABC123!! Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and send this off. And when we send it off, what do we get back? A 200 with the user object down below. Now, obviously, our passwords are still in plain text, but that's fine for the moment. The thing we're actually testing here is that the saving happened successfully. Now, if we keep the data exactly the same and send off another request, you should get a 400 back. This 400 is telling you that you have a duplicate key in the to-do app users collection. The email is already taken, which is a pretty big problem if you're trying to sign up using that email. This is fantastic. Next up, we can test some other things like sending an invalid email. If I do that, we're going to get a 400 back with a validation error. If I try to send an invalid password, like the letter A, we're also going to get an invalid password message down below. With this in place, we are now done. Obviously, the route is not complete. We don't have authentication or password hashing set up, but we have a pretty good basic version that gets us going in the right direction. I'm going to go ahead and save this request inside of our to-do app Postman collection. Before I do, though, I will set it back to some valid data, andrew@example.com, and for the password, I'll use password with the exclamation mark. Over here, I can now save that request using the exact same format we've used so far, the method followed by the URL, and we'll save it to the existing to-do app collection. I'm not going to be committing our changes just yet. We're not quite done with the route, so it doesn't make sense to commit them. We'll be handling authentication and password hashing in the next several videos. After we're done with it, then we'll make the commit. That is it for this one. I will see you next time where we explore how exactly we're going to be authenticating users. Stay tuned. I will see you then.